If the Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith, then the foundation, the very essence of our faith, is the resurrection of Jesus. If Jesus truly rose from the dead, then he is everything he said he was. And he vindicated and proved his whole ministry and all of the things he said about himself. And therefore, all the world needs to fall before him and adore him and follow everything he teaches. But if he did not truly rise from the dead, then he's a fraud and he's a fake, and we should not follow him. And anyone who delves into Christianity at all kind of sees that, and they get it, that the whole crux of everything is whether or not Jesus truly rose from the dead. And over the centuries, some people who, for whatever their reasons are, have not wanted to believe that Jesus truly rose from the dead, have come up with all sorts of different explanations to try to excuse it away, that claiming that the resurrection never really happened. Some of them will make excuses that would make the apostles just look like they were mistaken in claiming that Jesus was risen, and others would even make it look like it was an absolute straight-out fraud. Let's look at some of the excuses people have given over the centuries. Some of them can be a little bit comical. First of all, a very common one was the hallucination theory, that Jesus never really rose from the dead, but it was such a traumatic experience for the apostles and the believers in him, and they could not accept the fact that he died, that he was, in their minds, he was still alive to them, and that they hallucinated seeing him. Very much like sometimes there are people who lose a loved one and don't want to let go and still imagine that their loved one is with them. And that might work with one person, but the 11 disciples, and then later 500 people who claim to have seen him risen from the dead, it's never been known that there was a mass hallucination like that. So that one doesn't hold water. Another one is what's known as the swoon theory. And they claim that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, he merely passed out. And when they buried him in the tomb, the coolness of the tomb helped him revive his strength. And so he didn't resurrect on the third day, he just revived. And he left the tomb that way. So he never really died, so therefore he never really rose. Except that one has a few problems with it. First of all, with all of the wounds that Jesus had suffered and everything on the cross, he would have been in need of immediate medical attention. And where would he have found the strength to be able to move that massive stone away all by himself? And then, of course, there were the guards on the outside who had sealed the tomb, and they would have noticed something if they would have seen this Jesus walk out of the tomb if he had done that. And also there's the problem of the witness of St. John, that as Jesus hung dead on the cross, one of the soldiers pierced his side with his spear, and immediately blood and water poured out. And now we traditionally see that as an image of baptism in the Eucharist flowing from the side of Christ as he hung on the cross, and fair enough. But there was actually a medical reason why St. John noted that. And when a heart stops beating, the blood and the fluids in the heart, the pericardial fluids, separate one from the other. And the other fluids in the heart are clear. So if a dead heart is pierced, blood and the fluid will flow out. And so when Jesus' side was pierced and blood and water flowed out, that was a clear indication that Jesus' heart had stopped beating for at least a half hour before that point. So therefore, he was clearly dead when he was on the cross. And John's witness of that, and he goes on to say, the man who gave the testimony of this, we know that his testimony is true. And then, of course, to say that would mean to say that the Romans botched a crucifixion. And the Romans had crucifixion down to a science. They did it so frequently, and they never would have botched it. Certainly not such a high-profile case as Jesus. So that one doesn't hold any water. Then there are others, such as the mistaken tomb. They claim with all of the confusion that people just didn't remember which tomb they took him to, and they went and found an empty tomb and said, oh, look, the tomb is empty. Again, not possible. They would not have forgotten which tomb they put Jesus in. And the Roman guards were there, and the chief priest, to make sure that nobody went near that tomb and it was sealed. They wouldn't have sealed the wrong tomb. That's, again, just completely untenable. Then there's the one that's called the lettuce theory. And I mean lettuce, just like salad. They claim that since it was a garden and the gardener was there, had just planted lettuce, and he was getting annoyed by all the comings and goings of people at the tomb. They were trampling his new lettuce, and so he moved the body to another place. And it's evidence, they claim, when it says, he is not here, see where they have laid him? Like, he's not over here, he's over there. And they try to use the scriptures even to support that. Except to do that, you have to leave out that one important line in between. He is not here. He is risen. See where they placed him. So you have to kind of play games with the scriptures to do that. And of course, that one's a little silly sounding. And then there is the craziest one of all, that I give it an A for creativity, but an F for credibility. Jesus had an identical twin brother who passed himself off as Jesus after the resurrection. Yeah, right, with nails and marks in his hands. He wounded himself just to pretend to be Jesus. Okay, could anybody take that one seriously? But the other very common one, in fact, the one that had most traction in the ancient world, and with many people still to this day, is what Matthew even tells us that the chief priests used to try to explain it away. In Matthew's account, immediately after the women, first of all, Matthew tells us that they were there and an angel came down. There was an earthquake, and an angel who had the appearance of lightning came down, rolled the stone away, and told them, "You're looking for Jesus. He is not here. He has been raised." And the Roman soldiers immediately went to the chief priests and told them what happened. And the chief priests gave them a large bribe and said, "You are to say we fell asleep. And while we were asleep, his apostles came and stole his body." And Matthew says, and this is the story that has spread among the Jews to this very day, whenever it was that Matthew was writing that down. Of course, the problem with that is that it's unthinkable that the Roman guard would all have fallen asleep at the same time. If you fell asleep on guard duty, the punishment for that was death. They never would have all fallen asleep. They probably did rotations. One would sleep while the others did their guard. But first of all, to think that all the Roman guards fell asleep at the same time, and that the apostles were somehow hiding, watching, waiting for that moment that all the Roman guards would fall asleep at the same time, something that you would never imagine, and they could go in and roll the stone and take the body away, and the soldiers didn't wake up through all of that. Of course, that's absolutely crazy to think of that. The other story that other people have used is that the apostles knew very well that he wasn't risen, and they just made it up. And they made it up simply because they wanted to save face. They didn't want to admit that they had fallen for another fraud. There were many people who came along at Jesus' time claiming to be the Messiah. And one mistaken belief they had about the Messiah was that he was never going to die. So all they had to do, if they did not believe someone was a Messiah, get him killed, and then his followers would disperse. And that's why the chief priests were so adamant with Pilate that Jesus not merely be punished, but he had to be put to death to prove to his followers he was not the Messiah, and then therefore the whole thing would fall apart. And so they claim, well, they knew very well that he never rose from the dead. They just pretended he did, just because they didn't want to admit to everybody that they'd fallen for another false Messiah. And that might have made sense if they did that just in Jerusalem in front of the chief priests and everything and claimed they'd seen him risen when they knew in fact that they had never seen him risen. But why would they go to foreign countries and bring the gospel to the ends of the earth to save face before people who never knew them, who had never heard of them, maybe even never even heard of Jews? Why would they go to the ends of the earth to try to save face in front of people that they had never met before, that were totally unaffected by anything that was happening in Jerusalem? And some people might say, well, they would have done it because, in doing that, they could become very famous and very wealthy and rulers of kingdoms and stuff, and it would serve them very well. Except that's not what happened to the apostles. When they went, yeah, sure, there were some people who believed, and followed. That's why the church is here to this day. But there were many others who did not and were angry because the apostles, in telling them the truth about Jesus risen from the dead, was telling them that their gods were false gods and they had to leave them and worship Jesus instead. And the response was one of violence. All of the apostles, except for St. John, who died of natural causes, and they say about the age of 110 years old, all of the apostles died martyrs for Jesus, and violent, painful deaths. Peter was crucified like the Lord was, and he even asked to be crucified upside down to show that he was less than Christ, that he didn't feel he had that he was worthy to die the same way that Jesus did. Andrew was crucified, but he was tied to a cross and left for 3 days on the cross. Simon the Zealot was sawed in half. Thomas boiled in oil, and probably the worst of all, Bartholomew, flayed alive like a human potato. Now, if these men had made all of this up, don't you think one of them would have cracked and under the pressure of it all said, whoa, wait, all right, keep your knife away from me, keep those nails, don't crucify me, all right, this joke has gone too far, all right, yeah, I made it up. Somebody would have cracked. Maybe one of them might have been stubborn enough to rather die rather than admit that he had lied. But all 11 of the 12, including Matthias, who was chosen to replace Judas Iscariot, it's impossible, inconceivable, that not one of them would have broken under the pressure. And they knew if they died for Christ, that they would reign with him in his kingdom, and it would guarantee that they would be with him again. And would they have thought that if Jesus didn't truly rise from the dead, would they say, well, he didn't save himself, but he's going to save us? Would that make any sense? So no, the foundation of our faith is the witness of the blood of the apostles, that they went to their deaths convinced they'd seen Jesus risen from the dead. And the scriptures are very clear about that. Notice how they don't make any apologies for the weakness of the apostles, for the fact that they're incredulous in believing. Last week we heard of Thomas saying, until I can put my fingers in the nail marks, I will not believe. Today's gospel reading, when Jesus appears to them and they think they're seeing a ghost, and he says, why do these thoughts enter your mind? Don't you see? A ghost does not have skin and bones, as you can see I have. And he took a piece of fish and ate it in their presence to show them he was truly risen. Yes, the blood of the apostles proves to us that Jesus is truly risen, and we can believe it too. And therefore, Jesus' resurrection from the dead is our promise of resurrection as well. On the day of our baptism, we were baptized into Christ and promised eternal life with him. Our souls in his kingdom, when our life is over here, if we have remained faithful to him, and on the last day when Jesus returns in glory, body and soul perfected, living in the glory of his kingdom. And that is our hope and our promise and our joy. And that should help us want to live each and every day remembering just that and saying, Lord, help me through everything I have to experience to make sure that when I die, my soul can enter your kingdom. And when you return on the last day, I will rise from the dead to the glory of the righteous. And that reminds us that we have nothing whatsoever to fear. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the absolute promise of the defeat of all evil. And the pains and the sufferings that we endure now, they're only temporary. Yeah, they will afflict us for a time. But if we remain faithful to Christ, no matter what happens to us, we can turn those sorrows and those trials into a means to grow closer to the Lord, to be one with him, so that we know that nothing that's happening to us can keep us from Christ. In fact, we can take all of the things that Satan means to take us away from the Lord, that he brings into our lives, and instead turn them against him and make us turn closer to the Lord himself. And we realize we have absolutely nothing whatsoever to fear except for living in sin. That should be the only thing we are afraid of dying in a state of mortal sin where we cannot enter the glory of God's kingdom. And even if we have to lose absolutely everything we have here on earth, even our very life itself, for the sake of Christ, he will bring us into his kingdom, and we will share his glory with the apostles and all the other martyrs and saints who have gone before us. And so, my friends, the resurrection of Jesus is the greatest news the world has ever heard. It tells us, do not be afraid. Something that is said in the scriptures, they say 365 times, literally one for every day of the year. Do not be afraid. We have nothing to fear. Christ has won the victory, and if we remain faithful to him, we too will share in that victory. And it will help us now here on earth to give us joy beyond anything all of the treasures of the world could bring us. and the ultimate promise of salvation with him, of our souls being in the loving embrace of Christ, sharing in his loving caress for all of eternity. And so we realize that the greatest news the world has ever heard was the word spoken by the angel to the women that first Easter morning. You are looking for Jesus, the crucified one. He is not here. He has been raised. Alleluia.